Okay, let's dive in. We're tackling a case today that, well, it really gripped the entire country, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Front page news for months.
Dominated headlines, sparked some really intense debate. We're talking about the disappearance and death of little Caylee Anthony and, of course, the trial of her mother, Caylee Anthony.
Yeah, this wasn't just another news story. It felt like it became this huge cultural moment, a really public tragedy with so many questions left hanging even after it was all supposedly over.
And that's our goal here in this deep dive, really. We want to unpack the sequence of events, the investigation, the trial, the fallout. We're pulling the key details from our source material to help you navigate all the complex layers of this story.
Right. So let's set the scene first. Caylee Anthony, just 2 years old, living in Orlando, Florida.
With her mom, Casey, and her grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony.
Correct. And the first official alarm bell rings on July 15, 2008. But what's immediately striking is what the source tells us Cindy Anthony said on that 911 call.
Yeah, get this. She told the dispatcher she hadn't actually seen her granddaughter Caylee in 31 days.
31 days. A whole month.
And during that time, the source points out, Casey had been giving her parents all these different conflicting stories about where Caylee was.
Exactly. And when the police get involved, Casey starts making these claims that, well, just weren't true.
Like the nanny story.
Yeah, the whole thing about a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, Zanny. She called her kidnapping Caylee way back on June 9th.
And she also lied about her job, right? Said she worked at Universal Studios.
Claimed she told coworkers Caylee was missing. Even said she'd talked to Caylee after the supposed kidnapping. These early lies, they became really central to how people viewed Casey, and later, obviously, to the charges.
Because the police figured out pretty quickly these stories didn't add up.
Right. So Casey's arrested, initially for things like giving false statements, child neglect.
But then, as the investigation continues, the charges escalate. By October 2008, it's first-degree murder.
And she pleads not guilty to that.
Then, months go by, and we get to December 2008, a really grim discovery.
Yeah, December 11th. A meter reader who'd actually reported seeing something suspicious near the Anthony home earlier.
He finds Caylee's skeletal remains
in a wooded area, not far from the house. And the source specifically mentions what was found with her. A blanket, a laundry bag, and duct tape.
Duct tape. That becomes significant later. And adding another layer of difficulty, the medical examiner couldn't pinpoint an exact cause of death.
Right. The ruling was homicide by undetermined means. No smoking gun, so to speak, in terms of the physical evidence saying exactly how she died.
So you've got this undetermined cause of death, the lies from Casey, the month-long delay in reporting.
It just exploded. Massive immediate media attention. Some people started calling it the social media trial of the century.
And huge public outrage, mainly aimed at Casey, even way before the trial started. That public reaction, it really shaped the whole narrative around the case.
Definitely. So with that sort of backdrop, the case moves into the courtroom. And this is where you get these two completely opposite narratives about what happened to Caylee.
Yeah, a real battle, fought mostly with circumstantial evidence, it seems.
Absolutely. The prosecution painted a really disturbing picture. They argued Casey intentionally murdered Caylee.
Why? What was their motive theory?
Basically, that she wanted freedom from being a mother. Their specific claim was pretty horrific. That she used chloroform to knock Caylee out.
Oh, wow.
And then used that duct tape, placing it over her nose and mouth to suffocate her before dumping the body.
Okay, that's the prosecution. What about the defense, led by Jose Baez?
Completely different story. They argued Caylee's death was a terrible accident.
An accident? How?
An accidental drowning in the family's swimming pool, supposedly on June 16th. And they claimed George Anthony, Caylee's grandfather.
Casey's father.
Right. They claimed he found the body and decided to cover it up, with Casey's knowledge, maybe to shield her from neglect charges. They also brought up allegations of long-term abuse influencing Casey's erratic behavior afterwards.
So two starkly different possibilities. And the jury had to sift through all this evidence, much of which, as you said, could be interpreted in wildly different ways.
Exactly. Like, take the smell in Casey's car trunk.
Right, the decomposition smell.
The tow yard guy who got the car,
Yeah.
he testified it smelled strongly like, human decomposition. George Anthony initially said something similar, confirmed it in court.
But then Cindy Anthony, Casey's mother, she testified for the defense, didn't she?
Yeah, she said that dramatic 911 call she made about the smell, saying it smelled like someone died, was basically an exaggeration. Said she was just frustrated and upset. So, Who do you believe?
That really highlights the issue with witness memory and emotion, doesn't it? Then there was the computer evidence. That was a big one initially.
Huge. The initial testimony suggested searches for chloroform, like 84 times. Plus things like household weapons, neck breaking. Sounds pretty bad.
But then, get this, the source says after the trial, the guy whose software counted those searches admitted it was a bug.
A software glitch. Seriously?
Yeah, said there was actually only one search for chloroform.
Just one. That changes things significantly.
And then Caylee Anthony testified that she was the one who did that single search.
She searched for chloroform.
Well, she claimed she was trying to search for chlorophyll, for plants, and just misspelled it. And she argued her work records, which seemed to show she wasn't home then, were wrong.
Wow. So a potentially damning piece of evidence sort of evaporates, or at least gets a completely different explanation.
Right. Then you had the cadaver dogs.
The prosecution brought in handlers who testified their dogs alerted to the scent of human decomposition.
Where?
In the trunk of Casey's car, and also in the family's backyard.
Okay. And what about the duct tape found with Caylee? That must have been heavily debated.
Oh, massively. The medical examiner thought it contributed to the homicide, believed it was put on before decomposition really set in.
And there was something about a sticker.
Yeah, an FBI examiner testified they saw what looked like the faint outline of a heart-shaped sticker on the tape. But then the defense pathologist argued the tape was put on after decomposition.
Why did they think that?
They questioned why there wasn't residual DNA on the tape if it had been stuck to skin for that long. Plus, the defense showed the jury that the family had actually buried pets in the yard before.
Wrapped in blankets and tape.
Exactly. So they presented that as a possible, innocent explanation for why tape might be involved, countering the prosecution's suffocation theory.
So many conflicting interpretations. What else? There was hair evidence, right?
Yeah, a hair found in the trunk. An FBI analyst linked it to Caylee and testified it showed something called root banding. Based on a study they sort of rushed for the trial, they said this specific banding had so far only been seen in hair from someone who was deceased, post-mortem banding.
Okay, that sounds potentially significant.
It does, but then you had perhaps the most controversial forensic evidence, the air sampling.
Ah, yes, testing the air in the trunk.
Right. A scientist testified as testing detected compounds linked to decomposition and also chloroform.
But the defense pushed back hard on that.
Very hard. They pointed out this specific technique had never, ever been used in a criminal trial before. And the expert refused to share his underlying database, the one his conclusions were based on, because it was proprietary.
So big questions about its reliability in court.
Huge questions. And finally, there was this witness, Crystal Holloway, a volunteer searcher.
What did she say?
She testified. George Anthony told her Caylee's death was an accident that snowballed out of control.
Okay, that fits the defense narrative.
It does, but on cross-examination, the prosecution brought up her earlier police statement, where she apparently said George expressed it as his belief it was an accident, not stating it as a known fact. And George himself denied having an affair with her or ever saying that.
So, just layers upon layers of conflicting testimony and evidence, or maybe lack of definitive evidence. The jury had a massive task.
An incredibly difficult task. And after weeks of hearing all this, they went to deliberate.
And the verdict came on July 5th, 2011.
Yes. The jury found Caylee Anthony not guilty of first-degree murder.
Not guilty of aggravated child abuse.
And not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child.
But guilty on some charges.
Yes, guilty on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement.
Which specific lies were those related to?
Those were tied to the initial investigation lies, telling detectives she worked at Universal Studios, the whole the nanny story.
Saying she told coworkers Caylee was missing.
And claiming she spoke to Caylee after the supposed kidnapping. Basically, the lies she told in those early police interviews.
And the sentence for those misdemeanors?
She got the maximum. 1 year in county jail for each count, served consecutively, so 4 years total, plus $1,000 fine for each.
But she didn't serve 4 more years, right?
No, because she'd already been locked up since her arrest back in October 2008. So with credit for time served, she was actually released just 10 days after the verdict.
That must have shocked a lot of people, and I read something about an appeal on those lying charges.
Yeah, that's an interesting point from the source. Later on, an appeals court actually overturned 2 of those 4 convictions.
Right.
They basically ruled that because the lies all happened during like 2 main interviews, they couldn't be treated as 4 totally separate offenses. So the convictions were reduced to 2 counts.
Gotcha. Was there any financial penalty besides the fines?
Yes, under Florida law, she was ordered to pay back the state about $217,000
For what?
for the costs of the investigation, but specifically the costs incurred during that initial phase when Caylee was considered missing, before it officially became a homicide case.
Okay. So the verdict comes down not guilty on the major charges. What was the reaction?
Oh, it was immediate. Yeah, overwhelmingly negative, right across the U.S. Just this massive wave of public outrage.
People were furious. Lots of comparisons to the O.J. Simpson verdict, I remember.
Exactly. Social media just exploded, and it really fueled the debate about media influence.
Yeah, the defense team, especially Baez, was very critical of the media coverage, weren't they?
They really were. They called it a media assassination, blaming certain TV personalities in particular for basically convicting her in the court of public opinion long before the jury got the case.
And the source mentions some analysis about a gender gap in how people reacted.
Yeah, apparently studies or polls suggested women were more likely than men to believe Caylee was guilty and to be really angry about the acquittal. Some analysis link it to societal ideas about, maternal instinct.
Interesting. What did the legal and psychological experts say about why this case was such a phenomenon?
Well, a few things. Obviously, the tragedy of Chan's death, but also the uncertainty, the lack of a clear motive, the evidence that could be read multiple ways. There was also commentary, like we said, about media potentially pre-convicting her.
And criticism of the prosecution, too.
Some argued the prosecution may be overcharged by going for first-degree murder or seeking the death penalty when the evidence was largely circumstantial. And the whole CSI effect idea came up again.
You mean jurors expecting perfect forensic proof like on TV?
Yeah, that maybe jurors now have unrealistic expectations. Plus, lots of discussion about what reasonable doubt actually means and whether the jury applied it, too rigorously or just correctly based on the law.
What did the jurors themselves say afterwards? The source must have some insight there.
It does. Some jurors said publicly they were, sick to their stomachs over the verdict, but they felt bound by the evidence or lack thereof. They insisted they couldn't let emotion or public opinion sway them, only what was proven in court.
Did they buy the prosecution's motive?
Apparently, they had serious doubts about it. And the jury foreman specifically said that lingering questions about George Anthony's possible role, raised by the defense, played a part in creating that reasonable doubt.
Though didn't one juror later express some regret?
Yes. Years later, one juror reportedly said he wished they hadn't acquitted her completely, that he maybe should have pushed harder for aggravated manslaughter or abuse. But at the time, the consensus was acquittal on the major charges.
It really highlights that gap, doesn't it? Between maybe what people felt happened and what could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in court.
Absolutely. That disconnect is key to understanding the reaction.
So, what happened to Caylee Anthony after her release?
Well, she had to serve probation first, but that was for an old, unrelated check fraud conviction. Apparently, she served it somewhere undisclosed because of all the threats against her.
And did any official bodies weigh in?
Yes, in August 2011, the Florida Department of Children and Families DCF issued a report. They concluded Caylee had failed to protect Caylee through action or inaction, and that this led to the child's death.
But that's a different standard of proof than a criminal trial, right?
Exactly. A lower standard, preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt.
Did she face lawsuits?
Oh yeah, several civil suits. Zenaida Fernandez-Gonzalez, the woman Caylee falsely named as the nanny, sued her for defamation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Roy Kronk, the meter reader who found the body, also sued for defamation. And Texas EquiSearch, the volunteer group that spent a lot of resources searching for Caylee.
They sued too.
Yeah, for fraud and unjust enrichment, basically saying Caylee wasted their time and money knowing Caylee was already deceased.
How did those end?
Caylee filed for bankruptcy in 2013, listing huge debts. Texas EquiSearch ended up settling and becoming a creditor, though likely didn't get much back. The defamation lawsuits by Fernandez, Gonzalez, and Kronk were eventually dismissed by the bankruptcy judge.
Dismissed? Why?
The judge found there wasn't enough evidence Caylee willfully intended to defame them, even though her statements were false. It's a high bar in defamation cases.
The source mentions some later, maybe more controversial developments too. Affidavits.
Right. Years later, a private investigator filed affidavits claiming Caylee had confessed to her lawyer, Jose Baez, and also alleged they'd had a sexual relationship during the trial.
Bay has denied all that.
Strongly denied it. And those affidavits were ultimately struck from the record or sealed by the court.
And more recently, anything else surface?
Yeah, a couple of things. In 2012, reports emerged about Firefox browser searches on Casey's computer from the day Caylee was last seen, specifically a search for foolproof suffocation that apparently wasn't presented at trial.
Wow. Why wasn't that used?
Good question. Maybe issues with how it was discovered or its admissibility. Then there was a 2022 docuseries where Casey participated.
What was the angle there?
It explored the idea that her alleged lying was a result of past abuse, a sort of pathological response, and claimed the police didn't properly investigate her father, George.
And she's active online now.
Apparently, as of early 2025, the source says she's been using TikTok and Substack, calling herself a legal advocate. And she's made claims recently, like alleging her pregnancy with Caylee was a result of being drugged and raped.
Okay, so the story continues to evolve in some ways. Did the case lead to any legal changes? I remember hearing about Caylee's law.
Yes, that was a direct result. A big public push for laws requiring parents or guardians to report a child missing or deceased much faster.
So setting deadlines, like 24 or 48 hours.
Exactly. Several states either passed or considered laws like this, aiming to prevent that kind of month-long delay we saw in Caylee's case.
Makes sense on the surface. Was there any pushback?
Yeah, some criticism. Concerns that these laws might flood police with false reports, straining resources, or that they could accidentally criminalize frantic parents who are searching desperately on their own before thinking to call 911 immediately. So, unintended consequences were a concern.
So if we pull back and look at the whole thing, this case with no definitive answer on how Caylee died and this huge public reaction clashing with the legal verdict, it really makes you grapple with some tough stuff.
It really does. You think about the limits of circumstantial evidence, how much weight can it carry? How powerful are media narratives in shaping what people believe, regardless of courtroom facts?
And the whole concept of reasonable doubt. What does it mean? How is it applied? And what happens when the public feels it wasn't met, even if legally it was?
Yeah, the burden of proof is fundamental to the system, but cases like this really test public understanding and acceptance of it.
So here's something to maybe leave you thinking about. In a situation like this, with so much uncertainty, conflicting stories, and evidence open to interpretation, can the legal system truly deliver what feels like justice? Especially when the jury's decision, based on that strict legal standard, clashes so strongly with public sentiment.
And following on that, what role should public opinion or the media play, if any, when the evidence presented in court just doesn't cross that high threshold needed for a conviction on the most serious charges? It's a really complex intersection of law, emotion, and public perception.